How do you start Flippin science? We're looking at the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles.
Nitrogen is cool. It starts with fixation in the atmosphere. In the atmosphere. It combines with hydrogen to make ammonia. But there's another way. But there's another way.
Science understanding we're going to look at nutrients within an ecosystem are involved in biogeochemical cycles, represent the nitrogen and phosphorus biogeochemical cycles, and understand that humans can interfere with natural cycles. So what is a biogeochemical cycle? All organisms need water and nutrients in order for their metabolism to work so that they can grow and reproduce. Nutrients are cycled between biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. This cycling we call a biogeochemical cycle, as it's influenced by biological, geological and chemical interactions. If we have a look at this image down here, we can see we've got geology in terms of the rocks, we've got chemistry in terms of things like burning, and we've got biology in terms of microbes and consumers and plants over here, and algae as well. So we have biological, geological and chemical influences in terms of these substances that we're looking at and how they cycle through the world. So let's look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is required to make all kinds of important organic compounds, such as ATP, amino acids which make proteins, chlorophyll, DNA and RNA. So down here we can see some of the compounds that contain nitrogen. So here we have, this is ATP, which is an energy carrying molecule. Here we have some amino acids. If you join amino acids together you get proteins. That's what this is. This is A, T, G and C. These are the compounds that make up DNA. And over here we have a chlorophyll. So we can see the nitrogens that are present in each of these compounds, and this is why we need nitrogen from the environment so we can make these compounds. Nitrogen is present as nitrogen gas, which is particularly unreactive because there's a triple bond between the two nitrogen atoms. Plants and animals can only use nitrogen in a fixed form, and that fixed form has to be soluble in water. Now, there are a few ways to fix nitrogen: atmospheric events like lightning, volcanoes, lots of high temperature events, specific species of bacteria, and also heat, like I said. They can fix nitrogen and turn it into a form that is soluble and able to be absorbed by plants, which is an important start to the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle has several steps like the other cycles. The first one is fixation. This is where the atmospheric nitrogen is turned into compounds that can then be used. So here we can see we got atmospheric nitrogen and it's turning into ammonia NH3. So if we look at some natural processes, we can see the nitrogen fixing bacteria down here, turning the nitrogen gas N2 into ammonia NH3. It might be in root nodules, it might be in plants. We also have some non-bacterial ones like lightning and volcanoes and forest fires. These provide high enough temperatures to break the triple bond between the nitrogen atoms and then allow it to react with things like oxygen and water in the atmosphere. Here we have some synthetic ways of doing it, so not natural. So we can have combustion in gasoline engines or just high temperatures produced by industrial processes. This can fix nitrogen. We also have fertilizers, and we're going to talk about fertilizers in a bit. Next step is we need to take the ammonia, which is quite toxic, and turn it into something that can be absorbed by plants readily. So here we can see the ammonia using specific bacteria to turn the ammonia into nitrites and then nitrates, and these nitrates are readily absorbed by plants, and that process here is the assimilation, where it's going into plants. From plants it can then be eaten by animals and the nitrogen is passed on. Another part of the cycle is denitrification, where leftover nitrogen in fixed form in the soil is turned into atmospheric nitrogen again by yet other species of bacteria. This is important as it returns nitrogen back into the atmosphere. As in the other cycles, we have decomposition. So when organic matter dies, it gets broken down by decomposing organisms, and that can return the nitrogen from the organisms back into the soil, where it can be reused by other organisms again. So plants absorb nitrates and turn these into amino acids, proteins, chlorophyll and other compounds. Again, we can see this process. We have nitrogen-fixing bacteria or ammonifying bacteria producing ammonia. That ammonia gets nitrified by other bacteria into nitrites and nitrates. Those nitrates are the things that are absorbed by plants. As I said, that nitrogen is in compounds that can then be absorbed by animals when animals eat those plants. So we can obtain our nitrogen from the amino acids and proteins that are present in plants. We get waste nitrogen produced from excess nitrogen that we take in. So all the amino acids we take in don't get turned into proteins. So that nitrogen is turned into a form that can be excreted by animals and then can be used by plants again. So in animals like humans, we make a compound called urea that we get rid of when we urinate. That can go into the environment and be reused by other organisms. So I've already talked about this briefly. So natural nitrogen fixation is where high heat and pressure, such as in lightning strikes, forest fires, volcanic eruptions, they can break the nitrogen atoms apart in nitrogen gas and turn them into fixed nitrogen that can then be absorbed by plants. Artificial fixation can occur in internal combustion engines, where you have high heat and you have nitrogen gas going in and reacting with other gases, such as oxygen in the atmosphere. We can also make fertilizers that have nitrogen in a fixed form, and this is done using a chemical process too. So down here we have ammonium sulfate, which is a fertilizer. It's good to add to plants because it has this ammonia, and that ammonia gets broken down by bacteria and turns into nitrites and nitrates that can then be used by plants. So how do humans interfere with the nitrogen cycle? By producing nitrogen fertilizers, we can increase nitrogen levels in waterways. So this happens when runoff flows over fields that have been fertilized. That runoff takes with it excess fertilizer that hasn't been used by plants, and that makes its way into waterways. It could also be leached from the soil, which is a process that happens deeper in the soil, but the outcome is the same. You get high levels of nitrogen containing compounds in waterways. This can lead to what's called eutrophication. This is where you get lots of algae growing, because algae love fertilizer, so they grow in large amounts. That blocks off sunlight from areas below that algae, and that means that less photosynthesis is happening beneath, and that reduces the amount of oxygen available in the water. Because there will be less plants in the waterway, that means there's less food for other organisms, so they die, and when they die, there's less oxygen in the water to break them down, so we get this nasty build-up of compounds which really aren't good for the water quality. Runoff makes its way into lakes and streams, and eventually rivers, and eventually out into the open ocean. And when it does, it carries that runoff with it. And if that runoff makes its way to coral reefs, this can be really bad. Large amounts of nitrogen fertilizers mean you get large amounts of algae growth, and this can choke off the light from the corals. Corals need light for photosynthesis to occur. If there's no corals, then you don't have your fish around your corals, and that really damages the reef. Coral reefs grow in really low nutrient environments. By adding nutrients in, this is really bad for the coral reefs. So let's talk about the phosphorus cycle now. Phosphorus is an important component of some of the compounds we've already talked about today, so DNA, RNA, ATP. It's also important in phospholipids, which are the compounds that make up cell membranes. So here we have DNA and RNA again. So here is uracil, which is used in RNA. We can see the phosphorus in the backbone. So it's a phosphate backbone that you get with DNA and RNA. Here we can see the phosphate group that's present in the phospholipids, which are the things that make up cell membranes. And here we can see the three phosphorus groups that are present in ATP. It's the snapping off of this third phosphorus group that provides energy for many cell processes. Where is phosphorus found naturally? It's found in rocks, phosphate rocks, floating around in seawater, and also found in soil. It's found in the form of phosphate minerals and phosphate ions. The phosphate ions are soluble in water, and again, this solubility means that they can be absorbed by plants. So here is a high phosphorus rock, for example. So let's look at the phosphorus cycle. So phosphates are absorbed into plants from rocks and soil. So we get weathering of the rocks and soil that contain phosphorus. That makes its way into soil. From soil can then be incorporated into plants. Consumers obtain their phosphorus for things like ATP by consuming plants and other animals. So that gets locked up in those organisms. When those organisms die or they produce waste products that contain phosphorus, then that makes its way into soils, turning into phosphates that can then be reabsorbed by different plants. Again, we can get runoff, taking away phosphorus from surface runoff, for example, or through leaching deep in soil. It makes its way into the ocean, and in the ocean we can get phosphate rocks being produced, and then the cycle can begin again. It's a very long cycle, this one, because the rocks need to be uplifted to the point where they can be weathered to produce more phosphorus for the soil. So how do humans interfere with the phosphorus cycle? Phosphorus can be mined from those phosphate rocks that I've talked about, or also in guano. Guano is leftover waste from birds and bats, so it can be found on islands and in caves. It can be used to make fertilizers that helps plants grow because you have readily available phosphorus. So in Australia we use superphosphate as a fertilizer very commonly because of our poor soils. Similarly to nitrogen, we get this runoff that can occur and also leaching deeper down in soils. So excess fertilizer that isn't absorbed by plants runs off into waterways, and that can lead to eutrophication that we can see down here. So we get algae growing, which decreases the amount of oxygen available for organisms, which causes them to die. And that leads to less oxygen in waterways and so on. Phosphorus can also be used in detergents. So sodium tripolyphosphate is used in many detergents. So wastewater from houses can contain large amounts of phosphorus, as well as sewage from homes, due to waste products from humans containing phosphorus. So this, again, large levels of phosphorus in wastewater and sewage can make its way into waterways and cause eutrophication, which could be bad. So today on Flippin Science, we looked at the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya!